Hello, my friends. Welcome back to YouTube Book Club. It's another day. It's another chapter of Come See the Fair. This one is called The Siemens Paradox. It's chapter 5, and I did look up what that was. It's an advanced art term for people who do drawings and stuff like that. And basically the idea is that even though there's only one perspective on the drawing, that it was a lot of mumbo jumbo, but to my understanding, the idea is there's only one perspective that is correct, and includes like all the different vanishing points, whatever that means. But even though there's only one technically correct perspective, even if you look at the drawing from multiple perspectives, it still looks realistic. That is my understanding of it. If you have a better understanding, feel free to comment below. Alright, now to get started. And a recap. So Ava and Henry made it back, and then when they got back to the house, Mr. Magister was there. He was talking to Henry's parents and blah, blah, blah. And then as he's leaving, he told Ava that she's got to come back tonight, but she has to come back alone. She can't bring Henry this time, but he's allowed to come back, just not this time. Chapter 5, Siemens Paradox. Ava began to dig in her bag for her money, but Mr. Magister laid a hand on her shoulder. No, he said, my friends do not pay here. He strode forward. The turnstile spun. Come, said Mr. Magister, and Ava followed, wincing instinctively as her thigh met the bar. With a yielding click, however, she passed through. The fair favors you, said Mr. Magister, and in a flash he was moving, lighting out across the fairgrounds with bright intention. As he passed the open window of Hayward's restaurant, he reached inside and took a fizzling glass of champagne from the hand of an oblivious gentleman. Cheers, said Mr. Magister, and he drank deeply, emptying the glass in a single draught. The gentleman inside blinked, bewildered at his inexplicably empty hand. But come, said Mr. Magister, what would you like? Lemonade? There has never been a summer day that could not have been improved with a lemonade. Mr. Magister settled the champagne glass in Ava's hand, empty and light. In a sudden movement, it became heavy, filled to the sloshing brim. Cheers, said Mr. Magister, with a sparkling grin, and once Ava began to drink, she found that she could not stop. Sweet, tart, ice-cold lemonade slid easily down to fill her belly. Everything whirled, everything swam. The glass was suddenly empty again. Excellent, said Mr. Magister. Now come see the fair as it ought to be seen. And with that, he led her forward. Magic kicked up in Mr. Magister's wake like dust swirling in a sunbeam. Grand statues on their pediments bowed low as he and Ava passed. Watercraft swam up seamlessly to catch them as they strode from the jetties. The blooms in the wooded island's great rose garden seemed to sing out their perfume in a composed harmony of fragrance, and in the mines building, Mr. Magister reached through the glass of a display case to make ice cream for Ava from a hefty lump of gold ice cream. Wow. Everything sparkled, everything danced. Laughter began to bubble out of Ava, and soon it was impossible to see at all clearly through the shining haze of her joy. On and on they went through the ecstatic evening, sailing from delight to delight. In the stock pavilion, the cattle capered and waltzed for their amusement, and on the midway, Mr. Magister bid the huge-scale model of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome to split wide open, revealing row upon row of tiny model bishops, cardinals, choristers, all celebrating a spectacular mass in their croaking wooden voices. On and on, faster and faster, more and more and more, until slowly, upon the observation deck high atop the manufacturers and liberal arts building, Ava became aware of herself again. Above them, the blue velvet sheet of evening was beginning to darken at its edge. Mr. Magister was beside her there, reclining on one elbow, pulling apart a croissant from the French bakery exhibit into a long, unending ribbon of pastry. Are you enjoying yourself? He asked. Ava turned to him, dumbfounded. Enjoying seemed like such a meager word. Excellent, he said. I'm glad. Because all of this is meaningless without you here to share in it. Me? Mr. Magister nodded. Magic must be experienced, witnessed, or else it's simply squandered potential, like electrical current ran straight through an interrupted circuit. Without you, Ava, the magic is incomplete. Without you, there's no magic at all. Could it truly be that there was something of her in all of this impossible beauty? Something essential? Tell me, Ava, said Mr. Magister, how do you come to be here? What brought you to my house? Ava took a deep breath, meaning to say that she didn't know, but instead she found herself speaking of Grandages, her early aloneness, Mrs. Blodgett. Soon she began to pick up speed, telling of the seances that she had given, of the train and the overstreets and everything that had been. Ava looked up when she finished, as if waking from a dream. Mr. Magister was watching her intently, gloved fingers steepled beneath his mustache. Ava, he said, I cannot say how happy I am that you have come. You must return as often as you can to my house. Come soak in the pavilion as if it were a great vat of dye, and in time you may find that you have taken on a little bit of magic of your own. Ava blinked softly. It was as if she had just been instructed to eat up all the chocolate in the entire world. Really? Me? Mr. Magister nodded. You. And eventually, Ava, when your magic is strong, you will find that the pavilion calls upon you to add to it in some manner, to give back, in your own way, some small measure of what you take. This you must do without reservation. It is the only price of your admission. Give back? How? Mr. Magister shrugged. In whatever way seems best to you. Others have contributed gardening, machinery, renovation. It is not the particular gift that matters so much as the fullness of its giving. But I shouldn't worry just yet. The sky above was growing dark. All around them, men and women crowded together towards the edge of the observation deck, their conversation thick as blizzard snow. Look, said Mr. Magister, there below is what we have been in your absence. Ava turned her eyes down to the court of honor, monumental buildings filled with marvels barely visible in the thickening dim. Now look again, said Mr. Magister, and see what we might be with your help. And just at that moment, a rippling gasp ran through the crowd. Applause broke out. The darkness had been banished. Ava had seen electrical light bulbs once, 3 of them, as she disembarked late and tired on a train platform in Missouri. They'd seemed wonderful to her, even then, like immortal fireflies trapped in their little glass domes. Now, before her waiting eyes, over 100,000 of them had come to life together at the very same time. They were everywhere, mounted on pediments, nestled in corners. Massive searchlights dove high into the sky, and the fair's fountains burbled with color. It was like nothing she'd ever seen before, a heaven's worth of light, twinkling and shining, giving shape and depth to all the wonders below. So, said Mr. Magister, will you join us? Ava nodded furiously, and the lights of the fair turned the tears in her eyes into little glimmering starbursts. Mr. Magister was positively giddy at her acceptance, and in his glee he plucked the light from a nearby bulb, the light itself somehow, through the unbroken glass, turning it, stretching it, and rolling it between his fingers. Soon he leaned over and tied it neatly around the first finger of Ava's left hand, like a ring, as a memento of the evening. The little bow glowed between them, and Ava's cheeks ached from smiling. Excellent, said Mr. Magister. Now let us, for goodness sake, get you home for some rest. They traveled down the observation deck with a handful of other fairgoers, and though the two of them disembarked from the little elevator onto a floor that had not been there on the way up, no one seemed to take any notice. Ava knew precisely where they were, though. There was something in the smell of this place, some sweet, dusty electricity. And when the arched door beneath the lion's head came into view at the end of a corridor, she was ready to go home. "Shall I expect you tomorrow, then?" asked Mr. Magister. Ava nodded. "And Henry? Will you bring him with you, too?" "I will." Mr. Magister nodded. "I thank you for coming alone tonight. It is an admirable thing to trust in one's friends, of course, but like all virtues, it has its limits." Ava nodded. "Very well," said Mr. Magister, and to the lion above the door he said, "Prairie Avenue." The door swung open. Slowly, Ava stepped forward. She was suddenly very weary indeed. "Understand me, Ava," said Mr. Magister. "You have brought Henry to my halls, and now you must answer for him. He is your responsibility." Ava nodded. "I understand." "Very good," he said. "Until tomorrow." But Ava hesitated. "Mr. Magister?" "Yes?" There was something in the pavilion, a kind of feeling, different, better. It wasn't that she didn't want to mention her parents directly. It was just that she didn't see how she could quite explain what she meant to an adult, and every moment she spent stammering seemed like a diminishment of the good, clean warmth she felt. "What I mean is," she said, "do you think I'll be able to carry it with me someday, if my magic is strong enough?" Mr. Magister gave a dazzling smile. "Why," he said, "you must come and find out." Ava's brain gave a buzzing throb as she passed over the lion's threshold, and when she looked up from her hand again, she found herself alone on the sidewalk in front of Overstreet House. A shiver ran down her back in the sudden dim. It was time for bed. Ava was woke the following morning by a sharp rapping at her bedroom door. Before she could even answer, Henry stepped inside. "Ava," he said, "Ava, we have to go back." Henry tossed his sketchbook onto the bedspread. "I don't understand how it works," said Henry. "I have to get a second look." This is what he drew. Sorry, I'm not sure if you could actually see that. Ava wanted to tell him what had happened the night before, to reassure him that Mr. Magister was expecting them, but she wasn't quite sure how she could explain. Earlier, on the way to the fairgrounds, Ava looked up to find him staring at the plain copper ring on her left forefinger. She thought he was going to ask where it had come from, but he turned his head to look out the window instead. She'd always worn that ring, ever since she could remember. Hadn't she? Willie dropped them off at the gate. Ava watched Henry pay for his admission, only to feel the sudden jangle of his coins arriving in her pocket the moment he went through the turnstile. She pushed in after him, not bothering to pay. They began to search for a way into the pavilion immediately, but it was only after long looking that Henry found it behind the reproduced Yucatan ruins at the southeastern extremity of the grounds. "Ava!" said Henry. "Ava!" There, on the other side of a low stone archway, was not the vision of the rippling south pond that they ought to have seen, but a high, narrow entryway paneled in dark wood. "I knew it," said Henry. Ava smiled and pushed him forward. On either side of the arch were two weathered geometrical lions carved into the stone. As soon as they were inside, Henry began to sketch fluidly, mapping out the floor plan as best he could. Ava stepped into the front oak hall, eager to see through which door she might feel her parents again, and she stopped, listening, waiting, making herself as still and quiet as could be. No. Whatever whisper of warmth there had been on her earlier visit was hidden from her now. But all the same, the world smelled different here. toasted, tingly, electric, and she could feel somehow the whisper of multiplying possibilities on her skin. Soon she felt herself drawn forward. Ava found Mr. Magister in a scarlet study upstairs, bent low over a table strewn with schematics and diagrams. "Ah," he said. "Hello, Ava." He'd evidently been hard at work. His jacket was slung over a nearby chair, and beads of sweat dotted his ruddy brow. "Hello," she said. "Are you feeling all right?" There was something ashen in his appearance that she couldn't quite ignore. "Not to worry," said Mr. Magister, shrugging into his jacket. "Something is slightly out of balance in the pavilion. That is all. I shall be fine. Is Henry with you?" Ava nodded. "He's trying to draw a floor plan downstairs." At this, Mr. Magister gave a chuckle of genuine amusement. "Bless him. I think he and I ought to have a little talk, don't you? Just so that he understands." Ava didn't quite know what this meant, but she nodded nevertheless. "Good," said Mr. Magister. "I trust you and the pavilion can fill a bit of time together until we return." Ava nodded. "Yes," she said. Oh, yes. She found herself peering through each passing door already, wondering who might be waiting on the far side of each labyrinthine corridor. "Wonderful," said Mr. Magister with a grin, and his footsteps faded away. Ava felt a tingling throb at the first knuckle of her left forefinger as he walked away. She'd worn a ring there once, hadn't she? Long, long ago? Ava thought she could tell when Henry and Mr. Magister left the pavilion. There was no sound, of course, and she didn't see them go, but something in the atmosphere, in the feel of the house, seemed to relax. It was like the lowering of the shoulders she always felt when Mrs. Blodgett left the room. Oddly, the thought of Mrs. Blodgett made her laugh. Slowly, Ava began to move from room to room, passage to passage, staircase to staircase. There was an undeniable warmth in the air, a kind of brightness, as if the house was preparing for a great holiday party, and she was slightly surprised each time she came into a new room and found it still and silent. In the nursery on the second floor, she decided to try summoning the presence of her parents by coming to a stop the way she'd done in the servants' hall. But magic rarely works the same way twice, and soon she grew bored of waiting. There was an intricate music box in the shape of a carousel on the shelf, and when Ava opened it, she saw a stable full of tiny horses who ran a full race each time the lid was lifted. She held it in her lap for some time, opening and closing the lid, watching the tiny jockeys vie for victory with genuine excitement. She thought she recognized the tune, but she couldn't quite say what it was. When she looked up, she was surprised that from the nursery window she did not see the tangled grass beyond the front porch, but a stunning view of Lake Michigan. The day was clear out there, and the border between the sky and the water was as crisp as an autumn apple. But when she looked again, only moments later, the water had an entirely different aspect. Hazy, steely pale. There was a sail on the horizon, and high in the sky a bar of light pink bespoke the shoreward sunset. Sunset? It was still morning, wasn't it? Ava looked down at the music box and back up again. Now the water beyond the window was dark, full of crinkling moonlit waves. Ava shivered. Was this the imbalance in the pavilion that Mr. Magister had spoken of? It almost seemed that the window was looking at her, somehow watching her. Ava pushed herself to her feet. She was getting hungry anyway, and she wanted to find a route back down to the dining room. If only she'd thought to ask Henry for her peach pit back, she might have had a snack for the long, uncertain way. She was nearly there, down in the great glass-walled conservatory, when she felt it a second time. The undeniable sense that she was being watched. At first, she thought that Henry and Mr. Magister had come home, but that didn't feel right. And it wasn't warm like the shadowy presence of her parents had been either. What, then, was this feeling? Something rustled deep in the leaves. "Hey," said Ava, "come back." But there was no answer. Ava was eating peach mousse from a small silver bowl when Henry and Mr. Magister returned, and she rushed out into the front hall to greet them. Mr. Magister was very pleased. Henry had a far-off look in his eye. They were both exhausted. "Good evening, Ava," said Mr. Magister. Evening? It only felt like mid-morning. But all the same, Ava smiled and said, "Good evening. I shall look forward to hearing how you both fared today, but now I imagine that Henry and I could use a bit of rest." Henry nodded blearily. "You may sleep in whatever room appeals to you," said Mr. Magister. "We don't stand on ceremony here." With a nod, Henry wobbled forward into the sitting room. Ava very much wanted to hear what had happened, but he was practically asleep on his feet. Mr. Magister was already beginning to climb the stairs. "But Mr. Magister," she said, hot on his heels, "won't Mr. and Mrs. Overstreet miss us?" Mr. Magister frowned and shook his head. "Recall, old Dr. Flood has cast a very convenient ambiguity for you two. I am quite certain your absence will go unnoticed." Ava nodded. "You are welcome, of course, to go back and sleep at Overstreet House whenever you choose, but I imagine you might begin to rather resent the commute. And now, Ava, I am quite exhausted." Ava smiled. "I'm not." What weariness and weariness she'd felt seemed to have been eaten away with her peach mousse. "It barely feels like noon to me." "Yes," said Mr. Magister, "our pavilion has only the most casual acquaintance with the flow of time. It is quite easy to lose track of it here." "Is that why you're always looking at your watch?" "My what?" Ava gestured to the golden pocket watch in Mr. Magister's waistcoat. "Ah," he said, "that's not a watch." "What is it?" said Ava. "A sort of pressure gauge, I guess." "A pressure gauge?" Now Mr. Magister stopped. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, Ava, I really do, but I'm afraid I am terribly tired now. I have to rest." Ava nodded. "Is it the imbalance?" Mr. Magister blotted at his sweaty brow with a pocket handkerchief. "Possibly," he said. "I shall put it right just as soon as I'm able. For now, Ava, good night. You will find yourself ready enough to rest when you lie down, I think." They had come to the end of a long gallery, and Mr. Magister turned up the adjoining corridor towards the lion-headed door. "Bed," Ava heard him say, and with a creak the door swung open and shut. All around her, the paintings in their frames seemed to let go a sigh. Navigation in the pavilion was not easy by any means. The seemingly infinite rooms had a way of jumping about, of changing places, as if they themselves were apt to go wandering, and the challenge of finding her way back to the sitting room was daunting. In the end, however, it was much simpler than she'd worried. Henry acted as a kind of anchor to her. All she had to do was think of him, and her feet turned in the right direction. By the time she reached the sitting room, Henry was snoring in an armchair. She'd hoped she might be able to hear about his time with Mr. Magister before he dozed off, but all of that would have to wait until morning. It was odd, though. Standing there beside him, watching his breath roll in and out like the waves on Lake Michigan, she felt something soft, familiar, and warm. Not precisely like the feeling she'd had in the servants' hall when she'd visited the pavilion before, but not completely different either. It was a comforting feeling. It was good. And with a stretch, Ava slipped her feet out of her shoes, curled up on a chair, and closed her eyes. When Ava woke, it was the bright light of the morning. Henry was already up, peering out the window on the far wall. "Good morning," said Ava. Said Henry. Ava stretched and slipped into her shoes. "So," she said, "how was it?" A long moment passed before Henry responded. How was what? Your time with Mr. Magister? Again, a heavy pause, and then Henry said, Come look at this. Ava made her way to the window. The sun, said Henry. It's over there, you see. He pointed off diagonally through the window pane in the direction from which the light was coming. But in the dining room, it comes straight in. So, said Ava. Well, all the windows are on the same wall. Really? Henry nodded, then trotted to the dining room door. Look. He was right. The sun was coming in different angles in the two adjacent rooms. Well, it is the Pavilion of Magic, after all, said Ava. I know, said Henry, but I think there's something wrong. Ava frowned. Mr. Magister did say there was a slight imbalance. An imbalance, said Henry. Of what? She shrugged. He said that he would fix it. Henry squinted one eye and tilted his head. Are you hungry? Said Ava, eyeing the dining table. Yes, said Henry, taking Ava's peach pit from his pocket. He held it gingerly, almost reverentially, in his open palm. Can you? Of course, said Ava, and she closed his hand in both of hers. Come back, she said in her heart. Come back, she said to the peach. And no sooner had the peach returned to its pit than Ava and Henry sat down beneath the window to eat. The sun warmed their backs. They didn't talk. Henry's shoulder leaned gently against Ava's, and they passed the peach back and forth, trading bite for bite. When the peach was finished, Henry led the way farther into the house, sketching in big, broad strokes as he went. Ava tried a handful of times to ask what he and Mr. Magister had done the previous day, but Henry couldn't seem to concentrate on anything other than the pavilion, and all of his answers sputtered out like a candle in the wind. And there was something in his sketching, too, that had shifted. On the train and Overstreet House, even at the fair itself, Henry had seen entranced whenever he set charcoal to paper, enchanted, enthusiastic. Now he moved his hands across the page sharply, as if he was angry, as if he was preparing for an argument. Ava tried to shake him out of his dark mood, gleefully calling him over to see a chessboard in the library peopled with salesmen and senators rather than knights and bishops. She even suggested a game, but one of his pieces insisted it wouldn't work for a player who wasn't even old enough to vote for it, and by the time Ava looked up, Henry had already moved on, returning relentlessly to several well-thumbed pages in his notebook, sketching, erasing, redrafting maps and floor plans and the exterior views of the pavilion. She tried not to let his indifference hurt her. After all, she knew the way the pavilion could intoxicate, could draw a person forward. All the same, she felt it paying as he wandered off without her. Did her friendship not mean as much to him as his did to her? But just as soon as this question had arisen in her mind, the answer followed. Of course not. How could it? Henry had never been as alone as she had been before they had met. He'd never even been as alone as she was right now. But then again, was she really alone? At every turn, the pavilion seemed to be leaning in to suggest otherwise. Through the walls in the loom room, she heard someone playing slow, deliberate hymns on an ill-tuned piano, and later, passing through the long, branching corridor, she thought she felt someone passing down an adjoining hallway. Thinking it was Henry, she went back for a closer look, but when she arrived, there was no one there. In the machine shop, though, its workbenches strewn with tools and gears, It was in the machine shop, though, with its workbenches strewn with tools and gears, that the sense arose most distinctly. She was being watched. There was someone present. Surely there was someone present, just there, just over her shoulder. Cato. Ava had no idea where this name had come from, but there it was, solid in her mind, like a hefty stone at the bottom of a water glass. She moved gently, just as she might have around a skittish horse, only allowing herself to turn her head slowly, and gradually a distinct image began to resolve in the corner of her eye. A boy in a leather apron and round, shining spectacles. He was staring straight at her. Ava whipped around, terror in her heart. But there was no one there. On the bench at which the boy had stood, a small, dismembered cuckoo clock was laid out, its working spread wide. Dust was thick upon the gears. Cato? Alright, we still have a few more pages left, so I'm going to finish them with next week's video because it's already getting a little bit long. Oh my gosh, this book is getting a little crazy. I just feel like there's something very wrong. I feel like she's definitely being tricked. And Mr. Magister's got to be a bad guy. That's all I'm saying. I don't know what you guys think. Or maybe not a bad guy, but like he's like the lure, the bait, for whatever is going on. He might be the bad guy, or he might just be the bait for the bad guy. All right, join me next week. We will be doing the very end of chapter 5, which is like 2 pages, and then chapter 6, which is called Where There's Smoke. Does anyone know what the end of that phrase is? Where there's smoke, there's fire. Okay, see you guys next week. Bye.